Taken at face value, the latest figures on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, suggest a growing epidemic in the United States. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 15% of high school children are diagnosed with ADHD. The number of those on stimulant medication is at 3.5 million, up from 600,000 2 decades ago. ADHD is now the second most common long-term diagnosis in children, narrowly trailing asthma. But a new report in the New York Times questions whether these staggering figures reflect a medical reality or an over-medicated craze that has earned billions in profits for the pharmaceutical companies involved. Sales for ADHD drugs like Adderall and Concerta topped $9 billion in the U.S. last year, a more than 500% jump from a decade before. The radical spike in diagnoses has coincided with a 20-year marketing effort to promote stimulant prescriptions for children struggling in school, as well as for adults seeking to take control of their lives. The marketing effort has relied on studies and testimonials from a select group of doctors who've received massive speaking fees and funding grants from major pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Keith Connors, a leading expert on ADHD, told the New York Times he questions the preponderance of ADHD diagnoses in the U.S., saying, quote, "This is a concoction to justify the giving out of medication at unprecedented and unjustifiable levels." Well, to discuss this issue, we're joined by 4 guests. Alan Schwarz is with us, award-winning reporter who wrote the New York Times piece, Sunday cover story called The Selling of Attention Deficit Disorder. He's written extensively about ADHD in a series of New York Times articles over the past year. Jamison Monroe is with us, a former teenage Adderall addict who now runs Newport Academy, a treatment center for teens suffering from substance abuse and mental health issues. He's also the executive producer of the recent documentary Behind the Orange Curtain, which looks at the prescription drug epidemic. Dr. Gabor Maté is with us from Vancouver, Canada. He is a physician and best-selling author. Among his books, Scattered: How Attention Deficit Disorder Originates and What You Can Do About It. His most recent book is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And we're joined by John Edwards. His son, Johnny Edwards, committed suicide in 2007, just months after he was prescribed Adderall and antidepressant medications at the Harvard University Health Services Clinic. We're going to start right there with our guests talking about your son, talking about what happened to your son, John Edwards, at Harvard University.
Good morning. Hi.
It's good to have you with us.
Thank you. So Johnny went into Harvard in 2006, and between his freshman and his sophomore year, I discovered he was on Adderall during the summer when he was home, and I kind of questioned. I thought Adderall was, from what I understood, was for attention deficit disorder, and I had some questions. I didn't seem, Johnny was a class valedictorian at his high school, one of the top high schools in Massachusetts, 4.0. Brilliant kid. He was, I think he was about a 4.0 or straight A student at Harvard. And he was also doing stem cell research and working on grants between his freshman and sophomore year. And he's just a brilliant kid. Which paled in comparison to what a wonderful human being he was. And it seemed rather odd that he would be on a drug for attention deficit disorder. He seemed like the last person that would be on drugs, how you could achieve what he's achieved and have that type of issue. But, from what he shared with me and what I understand, it seemed as though in his particular case, he may have been given it to somehow boost his confidence or for some other reason. And I found it all a bit odd, and I noticed during the summer when we were on a summer vacation in New Hampshire, he was having these huge effects with, best way to describe these whoosh effects, where he'd get these, there's bouts of anxiety, and he said it was due to the timed release product he was on, and his doctors were paying attention to it and working it all out. And the problem is when your kids go off to college and they turn 18, you're no longer involved in their care. Even though I made a request. I said, would you mind if I spoke with the person who's treating you? And he checked into that, and they said, it's not really necessary. And that's what he told me. So I assumed he was under great care. I mean, he's at Harvard, a wonderful leading institution in the country. And, you know, he would then was prescribed a couple of additional medications as well, which happened to be stimulants, as I learned later. And as part of that, he was feeling over the coming months, I guess he had significant anxiety or concerns about it. Even wrote an email to the person who he had been seeing, the nurse practitioner, and you know, indicated, should I continue to take these? And she said, yes, just make an appointment to come in and see me when you have a chance. And unfortunately, 2 days after that email, he committed suicide at Harvard Medical School, completely out of the blue. And you know, none of us in the family had any idea that something like this was. He had just been home for Thanksgiving, and it's just has obviously devastated myself, my family, my daughter in particular, Julia, and been very, very difficult time for us the last 6 years.
Alan Schwarz, how typical is Johnny's story that you wrote about in the New York Times?
Excuse me, you know, Mr. Edwards, hi. I'm sorry about everything. It's very atypical, okay, in terms of the ending, in terms of how despondent he became and how he acted upon it. I think that what most people are particularly concerned about is the process through which Johnny received what is technically, I guess, medical care. He went to the Student Health Center at Harvard, probably faked his ADHD symptoms, or at least exaggerated them, in order to receive Adderall and other stimulant medications. It happens all the time. The problem is that the procedure through which the diagnosis is made is really quite sloppy in many cases. If you read the deposition in the Edwards case, because there are some legal proceedings going on, the nurse practitioner involved in the diagnosis and care said that one of the reasons that she put Johnny on stimulants is because he drank a lot of Red Bull, and that's always a sign that somebody needs more attention help.
Didn't Marion Cannon, this is the nurse who made the prescription for Adderall, noted that beyond his general inability to focus, he'd received 2 minor traffic citations, further suggesting impulsiveness.
Well, it is known that people with ADHD do get in more traffic accidents because of their lack of attention, or perhaps the impulsivity of just taking a right turn when you kind of shouldn't, okay? But there's a big difference between knowing that ADHD folks get in more traffic accidents or working backwards and saying that people who get in traffic accidents have ADHD.
This diagnosis made within an hour of meeting him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the misuse of conditional probability, if I may, in this case and many others, is just laughable. Or laughable, perhaps not the right word here. But what you see is the misuse of the science, the nurse practitioner. And again, we are not dissing nurse practitioners. There are, I mean, really, a lot of people think they're better than doctors. So, you know, nurse practitioners, don't send me hate mail. The thing is that, you know, she had heard about the science about ADHD being, having 80% heredity. But that's not what that statistic means. She thought that 80% of kids with ADHD have a parent with ADHD. And because Johnny told the nurse practitioner that his father might have had it, and Mr. Edwards, you can certainly testify to that, you know, she took all these little signs as meaning ADHD. And this happens every day, hundreds of thousands of times across a year, of people just not really paying attention to what is a real diagnosis and causes real people real problems, and for which Adderall and other stimulant medications are an appropriate remedy. But we've gone way past that to the more recreational cosmetic use.
Why would Johnny want the Adderall? You're saying that he, you know, knew the language, very smart kid, and he wanted this drug, as so many high school and college kids are taking.
Well, please forgive me, because, of course, I didn't know Johnny personally, and Mr. Edwards, you're on the line, so I hope Mr. Edwards, is it okay if I guess here?
Yeah, no. And I'm also very open, so about talking about Johnny. So feel free. And I would say that I agree with everything that you said up to now. And no, I don't have ADHD as well.
Okay,
I've been diagnosed.
I just wanted to make sure it was okay. I talked about your son.
You.
Hundreds of thousands of college kids go to student health wanting Adderall because it helps them stay up at night and study. There's a lot of conflicting evidence over whether you actually perform better on these drugs, whether kids perform better on average. But the problem is that a lot of kids really do benefit. And so they get seduced by the idea that I can stay up really late, I can do all sorts of great things, and sometimes it blows up in their face.
Jamison Monroe, you call yourself a former Adderall addict, and you now are running the Newport Academy Rehabilitation Center and participated in this documentary called Behind the Orange Curtain that looks at the prescription drug epidemic. Why did you get Adderall when you were young?
Johnny's story sounds very familiar to mine, actually, just a little bit further on in time. So I went to private schools, prep schools. I graduated #1 in my class out of 8th grade, and then went to a very competitive high school, extremely competitive high school, and you know, was making decent grades. I had a C in an honors biology class, and you know, people were talking, counselors, parents were concerned, and you know, it was just life was happening. High school was happening. There were girls, many more distractions. The courses were arguably tougher in high school than they were in junior high. And but my lab partner was taking Adderall, and so were some of my friends. And so, you know, I tried it. I got a few, and I took one, and it worked. It worked really well. I could stay up. I could go to sports practice when I got home. I could study, I could do my homework, I could wake up early, take an Adderall, be right on target, be ready to rock and roll. And so I took it to get ahead, to get that advantage, to make better grades, to be able to study longer. And as we've alluded to a little bit here, it was that competitive nature. You know, I was just trying to keep up. And it is a performance enhancement drug, and that's what I see. And so what happened was, then I realized that it worked, and so I went to my parents and I said, I think the reason why my grades are kind of falling from the past is that I have ADD or I have ADHD. And as any parent would say when a child comes to you saying that they have this clinical diagnosis that may hinder their ability to perform, especially academically, they took me to a doctor. And so I went to a doctor, and I love what Alan said, because I did exactly that. I completely faked my symptoms and acted like I was distracted during the 45-minute or so test that the doctor gave me. And sure enough, when I walked out of there, I got a prescription for Adderall. That was in 1995. I had that prescription in various forms for the next 9 or 10 years.
And then what happened?
Well, so what happened to me and what we see in a lot of kids that come through Newport Academy is that, in fact, the first drug they do take is Adderall or some sort of stimulant study drug. And then, you know, the next year when I was offered a Vicodin or a Valium or some other type of pharmaceutical drug, my perceived harmfulness of these drugs was low. And what's the difference between one and another? And that's what happened to me and what we see in other kids. I developed a substance abuse problem. And then Adderall became just one of the many drugs that I was abusing and addicted to. I couldn't sit down and study, write a paper, or study for an exam without taking an Adderall. And so, and then near late high school and early college, my peers and I, we would crush them up and snort them. And so we were drinking and using the stimulant as a recreational stimulant, as well as a study drug. And then that developed into you know, cocaine and other drug abuse. And Adderall was always there for the all-nighters in the library. You know, it was absolutely necessary in order to get by and in order to study.
I wanted to bring Dr. Gabor Maté into this conversation, joining us from Vancouver, from Canada. You've written and spoken extensively about this. One of your books, Scattered, How Attention Deficit Disorder Originates and What You Can Do About It. You talk about the drugging of America's children.
Alan Schwartz's article is very significant, I think, because it points to a major dynamic in American medicine, which is, there's an article, he quotes Lawrence Diller, who's a psychiatrist, or at least a child's pediatrician in California, and Dr. Diller says that the pharmaceutical companies, referring to their success in inducing doctors to prescribe medications, Diller says that for an epidemic to take hold, there has to be a susceptible host, in this case the medical profession. And then Dr. Diller says, quoted by Alan Schwarz, that they must know something about us that they can exploit. And what the pharmaceutical companies know about the medical doctors is that we're in the grips of this ideology that reduces everything to brain biology and everything to genetics. So that it's not just a question of ADHD, it's a question of millions of kids being on medications of all kinds. ADHD drugs, the stimulants. There's 500,000 children in the States on antipsychotics who are not even psychotic. There are kids getting SSRI, antidepressants for OCD, for depression, for anxiety. So that this template of the medical profession reducing everything to questions of brain biology and then thinking that they can solve problems by handing out pills is what has given the pharmaceutical companies the foothold, which they've exploited so brilliantly, as demonstrated in Alan Schwartz's article. And I'll just add to that, that absent from that awareness in the medical profession is the science, which is not even controversial, but most physicians are not aware of it, that the brain biology actually develops in interaction with the environment, beginning in utero and in early childhood, number one. And number two, that an individual's physiology, including brain physiology, is in lifelong interaction with the environment. So when we have lots of children in trouble, when in Canada you have the number of prescriptions for ADHD going up 45% in the last 5 years, when you have the kind of figures that Alan has accumulated and demonstrated in his article, what are we looking at? We're looking at the huge impact of the environment on the troubled functioning of many, many young people and children. And to reduce that to a question of brain biology and to try and smooth it out by means of medications is an abdication of medical responsibility.
Alan Schwarz, what you write about in this piece, The Selling of Attention Deficit Disorder, is the selling of it. Explain the interests of the pharmaceutical companies and how they influence the doctors.
Well, let's remember that the pharmaceutical companies are capitalistic organizations whose not only interest is making money, their legal responsibility is to make money for their shareholders. It is not to take great care of America's children. Now, hopefully those two things can be aligned, but when push comes to shove, they want to sell product. And so the story that I wrote, and I think that the whole concept of the selling of attention deficit disorder is more is perhaps less a story of what Pharma did and more a story of what we let Pharma do. We have the underfunded FDA that can't check for advertisements ahead of time, that completely distort what ADHD is and what ADHD drugs do. Again, they're very good for a lot of kids, but a lot of times, and a majority of times I would attest, they do not get prescribed to kids with ADHD. I can prove that. Anyway.
What do you mean?
Well, if you look at the numbers, I'm a math guy at heart, and if you look at the numbers with a bit of a keen eye, it's clear as day. We can talk about that later, perhaps on another program. But you know, what you see is that they prey upon, typically, mothers' fears that their kids are going to be friendless, that their kids are going to have substance abuse problems later on, that their kids are not going to succeed academically. And what the pharmaceutical industry does, and it ain't no secret that this is what they do, is they take a study that's been funded with their dollars, okay, by independent researchers, that find a slight improvement on how many math questions get answered and how many math questions get answered correctly. A tiny little immediate effect. And then they put in the ad, improves academic performance. And then in one other ad for Adderall, there's a mother hugging her child who's holding a paper with a B+ on it, and the line is, finally, schoolwork that matches his intelligence. Now, what mother thinks that their child's schoolwork matches their intelligence? And it's a shame because the pharmaceutical industry could make a lot of money absolutely legitimately. Okay, and God bless them. But it appears as if they've gone well past what ADHD is, and they are preying upon the fears of the population.
Can you talk about the amount of money that the companies are putting into the advertising and the promotional campaigns and reaching out to the doctors? I mean, as you just pointed out, Alan Schwarz, it's not about what they do, it's what society lets them do, what the doctors let them do. But the funded research that isn't cited as their research, the doctors who go out and speak, being paid by the pharmaceutical companies.
I think that a lot of doctors do mean well. I really believe that. I think that they just lose sight of how they're human beings, and that when they're paid to say things, they begin to believe it. Now, there are also doctors who get paid by the companies to go out and talk to other doctors, and for that matter, prescribe to real people who, frankly, have just lost their minds, who don't know what these drugs do. They don't care what these drugs do. They just want to give it out, in part because they believe in it, and in part because it keeps the business coming in. And now with the insurance company rules, that's a little strong, but you know, you can get paid for a 5-minute med check. And so that's all it takes. You prescribe medication, you get your med checks every 3 months. And I know, you know, psychiatrists, there's one a couple of blocks from here where literally it will take you longer to fill out the paperwork in the waiting room than it will for him to diagnose you with ADHD and give you a prescription for stimulants. And that is not uncommon.
We're going to break and come back to this discussion. Our guests are Alan Schwarz. He's the New York Times award-winning reporter. His latest piece, Sunday Front Page, The Selling of Attention Deficit Disorder. Jamison Monroe is with us, former teenage Adderall addict, runs Newport Academy Rehabilitation Center. And John Edwards is on the phone with us. His son, Johnny Edwards, committed suicide. He had recently been prescribed Adderall, which he was taking. And we're joined by Dr. Gabor Maté from Vancouver, Canada. He is a physician, best-selling author, wrote Scattered, How Attention Deficit Disorder Originates and What You Can Do About It. We'll be back in a minute. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily, independent, global grassroots news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org today. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.